The Austin livestock auction house floor was deafeningly quiet. I stood in my work boots as my Uncle Silas strode over, demanding why I had not paid the $85,000 invoice for the prize Brangus bull he had bid on in my name. Before I could calculate this liability, my Aunt Marian smiled condescendingly, announcing the pedigree and title belonged solely to their son Warren now. I felt the familiar chill of lifelong exploitation. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. To understand how a family can casually assign an $85,000 debt to a 28-year-old large animal veterinarian, you have to look at the historical ledger of our relationship. I was the orphaned niece taken in by the wealthy, cold-hearted Gillespie family after a fatal trucking accident claimed my biological parents. From the very beginning, my presence in their Texas Hill Country estate was not treated as a familial bond. It was treated as a depreciating asset that needed to earn its keep. While my cousin Warren was handed luxury trucks, prime cattle leases, and university funds without ever sweating under a brutal Texas sun, I was categorized as unpaid operational labor. I spent my youth mucking stalls, vaccinating herds, and studying veterinary medicine by the dim light of a desk lamp in a converted storage room. The abuse was never a sudden explosion of violence. It was a slow, methodical conditioning. What people often fail to grasp about toxic family systems is the trap of normalized cruelty. When you are raised in an environment where your fundamental worth is tied entirely to your utility, exploitation simply becomes the baseline currency of love. They condition you to accept mistreatment as the standard operating procedure. You do not fight back because the boundaries of normal have been completely erased and rewritten by your abusers. I remembered my 16th birthday when my modest college savings account was quietly emptied by Silas to buy Warren a custom horse trailer. When I questioned the missing funds, I was told I owed them for the food I ate and the roof over my head. The psychological conditioning was masterful. I was trained to view my own exploitation as a debt of gratitude. I absorbed the inequity because I thought endurance was the price of admission to a family. When I finally earned my doctorate in veterinary medicine, a grueling process funded entirely by my own scholarships and late-night shifts, my Aunt Marian merely scoffed. She looked at my degree, then at my calloused hands, and asked why a girl would waste her youth knee-deep in mud when she could be marrying a petroleum heir. My silence in those moments was never weakness. It was the protective shield of an outsider trying desperately to earn a home that never truly existed. I had functioned as the silent investor in their version of family, footing the bill with my sweat and compliance while they reaped all the dividends. Every family dinner, every holiday gathering, I was seated at the far end of the table, constantly reminded that I was merely a charity case sustained by the Gillespie name. But standing under the harsh fluorescent lights of the auction house, looking at an invoice that would bankrupt my modest clinic, the final ledger balanced in my mind, the subscription to their family had expired. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. I rubbed my eyes trying to summon regret, but there was only absolute clarity. This was no longer a familial relationship. It was a hostile corporate takeover, and it was time to audit the accounts. I did not cry. I did not scream or make a public spectacle on the auction house floor. Emotional outbursts are for people who still believe the other party cares about their feelings. I simply turned around, walked out to my mud-spattered truck, and drove back to my modest, rented veterinary office. The drive was quiet, accompanied only by the hum of the engine and the cold, mechanical processing of my next steps. It was midnight when I unlocked the clinic door. I sat down at my metal desk, opened my encrypted laptop, and logged directly into the Shared Family Ranch Corporation ledger. For 5 years, I had quietly served as the uncredited forensic accountant and operational backbone for the Gillespie empire. Silas and Warren lacked the discipline to manage agricultural logistics, so the burden had inevitably fallen to me. I had managed the supply lines, balanced the vendor accounts, and maintained the credit ratings that kept their sprawling cattle operation afloat. I had complete administrative access to their entire financial nervous system. Staring at the glowing screen, I did not hesitate. I initiated a systematic clinical dismantling of their cash flow. With cold, surgical precision, I revoked my signature authority from every joint operational account. I canceled the pending credit transfers that were scheduled to cover their upcoming equipment leases. Next, I navigated to the vendor portals. I froze the corporate supply lines tied to my personal veterinary credentials, ensuring that not a single bag of premium feed or vial of livestock medication could be ordered under my license ever again. I watched the status bars load, each green checkmark confirming another severed tie. This was not revenge. It was basic accounting. I was simply cutting my losses and liquidating a toxic investment. To fully understand the justification for this absolute severance, one only needed to look at the financial history I was currently dismantling. When a severe drought threatened the Gillespie Ranch 2 summers ago, it was my signature that secured a drought relief federal grant using my own immaculate veterinary reputation. I saved them from foreclosure while Warren was busy gambling away livestock funds in San Antonio casinos. I had paid the property taxes on the South pasture out of my own pocket. I had covered Warren's veterinary school debts after he flunked out in his first semester. Every crisis they manufactured, I had subsidized. The retaliation was instantaneous, absolute, and completely devoid of emotional hysteria. I typed the final command, locked the primary operational account that Silas used for his daily expenditures, and closed the laptop. The transaction was complete. I had severed the financial artery that kept their luxurious facade alive. By morning, Silas would not even be able to buy diesel for his truck using the company card. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the autumn wind rattle the corrugated tin roof. They were completely unaware that the very foundation of their wealth had just been digitally vaporized. I felt no guilt, no lingering attachment to the bloodline that had bled me dry. The Gillespie family had spent my entire life treating my compliance as an unlimited resource. Tonight, the bank was officially closed. The silence in my clinic was profound, but for the first time in 28 years, it did not feel like isolation. It felt like absolute, undeniable control. Instead of recognizing their sudden vulnerability, the Gillespies responded with characteristic arrogance and fury. When toxic people lose their primary source of extraction, their immediate reaction is never self-reflection. It is aggressive escalation. By sunrise, my phone was flooded with furious notifications. Silas had attempted to buy coffee and fuel, only to have his corporate card declined. The fallout was immediate and vicious. I listened to the voicemails while brewing my morning coffee, treating the incoming threats as nothing more than data points in a risk assessment. Uncle Silas left a roaring, expletive-laced voicemail, his voice vibrating with pure rage. He did not ask why the accounts were frozen. He simply demanded that I restore access immediately, threatening to use his local influence to evict my clinic from the county-leased land I operated on. Minutes later, Aunt Marion called. Her tone was a chilling, calculated whisper designed to gaslight me into submission. She demanded an immediate public apology for embarrassing them at the auction house. She threatened to call the state veterinary board, leveraging her country club connections to strip me of my medical license, claiming she would spread rumors of professional incompetence. She spoke to me not as a niece, but as a disobedient servant who had forgotten her place. Then came Warren's contribution. Bypassing direct communication, he took to local social media channels. He posted a venomous, sprawling rant to the county agricultural groups, painting me as a deranged, ungrateful parasite who was actively sabotaging the family business out of pure spite. He claimed I was having a psychiatric breakdown and begged the community to pray for his family as they dealt with my toxic behavior. Their absolute lack of remorse was mesmerizing. There was no apology for saddling me with an $85,000 invoice. There was no recognition of the years of unpaid labor and financial bailouts I had provided. They were entirely consumed by their own entitlement, deeply offended that the asset they had exploited for decades had suddenly developed a firewall. They firmly believed that their status insulated them from any consequences. Every threat they issued, every public lie they posted, completely eliminated any lingering doubt or sympathy I might have harbored. They had handed me the green light to escalate my defense from passive detachment to active legal warfare. They thought they were intimidating a scared, compliant orphan into unlocking their bank accounts. They had no idea that they were simply providing me with documented evidence of extortion and harassment. I archived every voicemail, took screenshots of Warren's social media posts, and backed everything up to a secure cloud server. The family drama had reached its ceiling. I poured the rest of my coffee into a travel mug and grabbed my car keys. They expected me to cower in my clinic, terrified of their social influence and their loud, aggressive posturing. But intimidation only works if the target values the relationship. I valued nothing about them. I walked out into the crisp morning air, ready to initiate a legal siege that would dismantle their empire brick by brick. The emotional phase of this conflict was officially over. The professional execution was about to begin. Moving past emotional sparring, I shifted the conflict into the cold, unforgiving realm of corporate law. I dialed Julia Vance, a sharp, unyielding agricultural attorney who had been my roommate at Texas A&M. Julia now specialized in rural land fraud and complex estate litigation. We met in the sterile, fluorescent-lit conference room of her downtown practice. The transition from the dusty ranch environment to the polished mahogany of a legal office felt like a necessary upgrade in weaponry. I sat across from her and handed over the encrypted flash drives containing 5 years of the Gillespie family's unauthorized asset transfers, hidden ledgers, and diverted funds. Julia plugged the drive into her terminal, adjusting her glasses as her professional expression hardened into a mask of pure legal predation. For 2 hours, the only sound in the room was the rapid clicking of her keyboard as she traced the financial rot I had uncovered. I watched her cross-reference land deeds, equipment loans, and operational budgets. I had meticulously documented every cent they had bled from the ranch's equity to fund their lavish lifestyle. But I needed a licensed attorney to weaponize the data. Julia leaned back in her leather chair, tapping a gold pen against her desk. Her assessment was clinical and devastating. The conflict was no longer a petty family squabble over an auction invoice. It was a full-scale legal siege. She began drafting a formal, legally binding demand letter structured with the aggressive precision of a corporate indictment. The document outlined a staggering reality. Silas and Marion had executed an unauthorized $2.5 million land sale the previous year, burying the transaction beneath layers of shell companies and falsified board resolutions. Julia's demand was simple and unyielding. The Gillespies had exactly 30 days to clear the unauthorized $2.5 million transaction and restore the liquidated capital to the primary corporate trust. If they failed to produce the funds, we would initiate immediate civil litigation and forward the files to federal regulators for criminal fraud proceedings. The heavy, official parchment of the legal notice felt like a physical declaration of war. It stripped away all the emotional manipulation and country club posturing, reducing my family's arrogance to a series of undeniable, legally actionable liabilities. I read over the draft, checking the precise legal terminology. There were no emotional appeals, no demands for apologies, and no references to our shared bloodline. It was a sterile, transactional ultimatum. When you remove emotion from a betrayal, you neutralize the abuser's primary weapon. They could not gaslight a subpoena. They could not guilt-trip a federal audit. I authorized Julia to send the letter via certified courier directly to the main ranch house. I imagined Silas opening the thick envelope, expecting another desperate plea for familial understanding, only to find a legal countdown to his own destruction. Julia looked at me over the rim of her glasses, a glint of professional admiration in her eyes. "They have absolutely no idea what is about to hit them," she noted quietly. I gathered my coat and stood up from the conference table. "They thought I was just a farmhand," I replied. "They forgot I also managed the books." The transition was complete. I was no longer the invisible, compliant niece begging for basic respect. I was the architect of their impending financial ruin, operating entirely within the bounds of the law. While analyzing the corporate land titles tied to their emergency loans, Julia uncovered a detail so dark and deliberate that it made the breath catch in my throat. Just when I thought the conflict was simply about debt collection and corporate embezzlement, the script dropped a twist that elevated their actions to a devastating criminal level. The unauthorized $2.5 million land sale was not just a desperate cash grab. It involved the illegal seizure and quiet liquidation of the heritage herd. The heritage herd was a rare, genetically pure line of Spanish cattle, originally bred and registered under my late biological parents' names before the fatal trucking accident that orphaned me. Silas and Marion had not just stolen capital. They had systematically erased the physical proof of my true lineage. They had forged guardianship signatures to sell off the historic ranch acreage that legally belonged to my birth trust. The theft was not just financial. It was deeply personal, generational, and sadistically calculated to erase my parents' legacy entirely. As Julia spread the original brand registration documents across the table, my hands trembled, not from sorrow, but from a terrifying, icy rage. Forging county agricultural deeds and liquidating trust assets crossed the line from civil breach into Class A felony fraud. But the forensic discovery did not stop there. The deeper Julia dug into the bank routing numbers, the more the illusion of the Gillespie agricultural empire dissolved. Armed with proof of identity theft and corporate forgery, we discovered that the ranch was already on the verge of total financial liquidation. Warren's high-stakes gambling debts in underground syndicates and Silas's disastrous, leveraged agricultural speculations had left them catastrophically exposed. They were facing imminent federal bank audits and immediate foreclosure. The $85,000 prize Brongus bull and the flashy livestock auctions were nothing but desperate smoke and mirrors. They were projecting immense wealth to lure outside investors into a dying enterprise. The Gillespies had not just stolen from me to fund a lavish lifestyle. They had used my clean credit, my veterinary license, and my stolen land titles as a human shield against creditors who were already circling the ranch house. They were drowning, and they had actively tried to chain me to their sinking ship to buy themselves a few more months of breathing room. The sheer scale of the deception removed any lingering path to redemption. They were not just ungrateful relatives. They were desperate criminals who had actively plotted to ruin my life to cover their felonies. The revelation was the ultimate kill shot to my conscience. I stared at the falsified trust documents, tracing the forged signatures with my index finger. Every cruel comment, every excluded holiday, every moment I was made to feel inadequate was a calculated strategy to keep me submissive and blind to the fact that they were living on my stolen inheritance. They had assumed my silence was stupidity. They were completely unaware that the forensic evidence of their federal crimes was now sitting in a downtown law office. The blueprint of their destruction was now perfectly mapped out before me. There was no room left for negotiation or familial mercy. I looked at Julia and gave a single, definitive nod. "File the injunctions," I instructed, my voice devoid of any warmth. "Freeze every asset they have left." The trap was ready to trigger an avalanche they could not possibly survive. A harsh autumn wind rattled the corrugated tin roof of my veterinary clinic, the metallic clatter echoing through the sterile examination room. I was methodically cleaning surgical instruments when the heavy oak door swung open without a knock. Uncle Silas and Aunt Marian stepped inside, their faces flushed with characteristic, arrogant fury. My attorney, Julia, was already sitting at my metal desk, finalizing the federal injunction paperwork. "Why are you still renting this miserable shack?" Aunt Marian sneered, looking around the clinic with pure disgust. Julia adjusted her glasses, her voice dangerously calm. "What happened to the heritage ranch her father left her?" Before I could speak, Aunt Marian smiled condescendingly, crossing her arms. "That deed belongs to my son now." Julia went deafeningly quiet. She stood up, walked over to the heavy oak door, and locked it. The metallic click echoed through the room. She turned around, dropping a forensic bank report directly onto the stainless steel examination table. "Then I suggest you call your lawyer right now," Julia said coldly, "because whoever forged her signature on this deed just committed a Class A felony." Silas stared blankly at the paperwork, his mouth opening and closing in silent horror as the absolute finality of the documents registered in his mind. "Furthermore," I continued, maintaining my clinical, unyielding tone, "I did not grant you a 30-day grace period for the stolen funds. I bypassed the standard review and sent the forensic proof of your forged signatures directly to the regional bank's fraud division. They just permanently froze every emergency credit line you have. You have absolutely zero liquidity to cover the massive margin calls hitting this afternoon." Marian let out a sharp, strangled gasp, stepping back as if she had been physically struck. The blood drained entirely from Silas's face. They were completely defenseless, stripped of their stolen wealth, and exposed to the crushing weight of federal prosecution. I turned my back on them, walking slowly toward the surgical recovery ward. "Goodbye, Uncle," I said over my shoulder. "You can let yourselves out." I did not turn around to watch them leave. The heavy oak door eventually clicked shut, sealing them outside in the cold wind. The silence that followed was absolute, and for the first time, it belonged entirely to me. 6 months later, the dust of the Gillespie Empire's catastrophic collapse had finally settled across the Texas Hill Country. The main ranch estate had been seized by federal liquidators and auctioned off to settle the massive bank fraud and restitution charges. Stripped of their stolen assets and social standing, Silas and Marian had retreated in utter disgrace to a cramped, rented apartment on the industrial outskirts of San Antonio. Warren, crushed by his gambling debts and entirely cut off from his endless supply of unearned luxury, was working grueling odd jobs in a distant county, completely erased from the high society circles he once ruled. I stood on the green, rolling hills of the restored Heritage Ranch, which was now legally and physically secured solely in my name. The historic brand of my biological parents was freshly painted on the heavy iron southern gate. I watched a small, healthy herd of Spanish cattle graze peacefully under the golden afternoon sun. The morning routine of brewing coffee and walking the fence line was no longer a chore performed under threat. It was a ritual of ownership. Every acre of soil beneath my boots belonged to me, paid for in resilience. The air tasted different now, cleaner, unburdened by the constant demand to make myself smaller. The heavy, suffocating shadow of my adoptive family had finally been lifted from my shoulders, replaced by the profound quiet of a life built on integrity and absolute sovereignty. Standing there, feeling the warm Texas breeze, I realized the deepest truth about walking away. What people often misunderstand about toxic family systems is that they rely entirely on our guilt to sustain their survival. They teach us from childhood that endurance is a noble virtue, that protecting the family name matters significantly more than protecting your own soul. They condition you to believe that establishing boundaries is an act of betrayal. But the truth is, blood does not grant an automatic pardon for systemic exploitation, forgery, and cruelty. DNA is not a contract for infinite indentured servitude. Most society would tell you that family deserves a second, third, or fourth chance. that you must keep the peace no matter the personal cost. They demand that you sacrifice your own sanity to maintain an illusion of harmony that only benefits your abusers. I've come to realize that loyalty is earned through mutual respect, not extracted through obligation. But I learned that cutting the cord is never an act of malice. It is an act of supreme self-preservation. Releasing the burden of toxic bloodlines is the only way to truly reclaim yourself. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes, but it's the only way to set yourself free. And sometimes, that forgiveness means accepting that they will never be part of your future. When you stop bleeding to feed someone else's illusions, you finally discover the true, unshakable strength of your own ground. I had stopped being the silent investor in their fraudulent empire, and in doing so, I had finally claimed my own legacy. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to protect your peace and your future? How did you find the courage to draw that final line? Share your story and leave a comment below. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe for more stories of real justice and resilience.